Everyone thought Thomas was a fool when he didn't react. His land, a wide, beautiful stretch of earth that had been in his family for generations, was suddenly filled with construction trucks, workers, and noise. The Homeowners Association claimed the land was part of their expansion plan. 15 new commercial buildings were being raised, each worth millions. But Thomas stayed silent, watching from his porch every morning, sipping his coffee, while the neighborhood whispered that he'd lost his mind. Deep down, though, he had something no one else did, the original deed. The paper that proved every inch they were building on still belonged to him. He had discovered it by accident, a week before the construction started. It was tucked away in an old wooden chest that had belonged to his grandfather, sealed and forgotten. That paper was his quiet power, and as each building took shape, so did his plan. He wasn't angry, he was patient. He knew that letting them finish would make his move far more impactful. And as the final layer of paint went up, so did the tension in his heart. Everyone saw a quiet old man. But he was about to show them the calm before the storm. Months passed, and the HOA celebrated the near completion of their massive project. Shiny glass walls, polished stone, and brand new signs now covered Thomas's family land. People clapped, cameras flashed, and speeches filled the air about community growth. Thomas stood at the edge, unnoticed, his worn hat shading his eyes. Every nail hammered into the buildings echoed in his heart, a reminder of how easily greed can bury truth. But Thomas didn't interrupt, he smiled. He had spent those months preparing carefully. He met quietly with his lawyer, a longtime friend who knew every detail of the land's history. Together, they organized documents, photographs, and signatures. Not a single word of it reached the HOA. When the lawyer looked up at Thomas and asked, "Are you sure you want to wait until they finish?" Thomas simply nodded. "They took my silence as weakness. Let's make sure they see what patience looks like." By winter, the buildings were open. Shops filled with lights and customers. The HOA was proud, their biggest project yet. They even planned a grand ribbon-cutting ceremony. Invitations went out, banners hung, and the media was called to celebrate a new beginning for the neighborhood. And Thomas was invited too, almost mockingly, as the old local landowner. They had no idea they were inviting the very men who could end it all. When Thomas arrived that day, he walked slowly, his cane tapping the marble floor. People greeted him with polite smiles, not knowing what rested in the folder he carried, the deed, the surveys, and proof signed decades ago. He stood near the stage, watching the HOA president speak about unity and progress. Thomas's heart raced, not from nerves, but from justice. When they cut the ribbon, the applause filled the air. Then, Thomas stepped forward and quietly said, "Congratulations, you've built something beautiful, on my land." At first, laughter. They thought he was joking. Cameras still rolling, the HOA president chuckled and said, "Mr. Thomas, you must be mistaken." But Thomas opened the folder, his trembling hands revealing the yellowed paper, the notary seal still intact. The laughter faded. He placed the deed on the podium and said calmly, "You've built your empire on a foundation that was never yours." Silence swept across the courtyard. Reporters leaned closer. Thomas's lawyer stepped beside him and handed a set of official documents to the president. The realization spread like wildfire. The HOA's project, their $1 million investment, was built entirely on privately owned land. Thomas didn't need to raise his voice. His truth spoke louder than any anger could. The president's face drained of color. Thomas looked around, his voice low but firm. "You saw an old man and thought he couldn't fight back. But this land remembers who it belongs to." The next few days were chaos. News outlets covered the story non-stop. Elderly landowner reclaims property after HOA build. The HOA scrambled to explain themselves. Legal papers flew across desks. Some tried to negotiate, offering Thomas a large settlement. But he refused. He didn't want money. He wanted respect, and an apology for the years they ignored him. The entire community watched as the truth unfolded. Many who once doubted Thomas now visited him, bringing food, shaking his hand, and saying, "You did the right thing." But Thomas wasn't seeking praise. Late one night, he sat on his porch again, looking at the glowing buildings. "My grandfather worked this land with his bare hands," he whispered. "I just made sure his work wasn't forgotten." He smiled softly. The land, once buried under greed, had spoken through him. Months later, the court ruled in Thomas's favor. Every inch of those 15 buildings legally belonged to him. The HOA's faces filled the courtroom, pale with disbelief. Some members resigned, others vanished. But Thomas didn't gloat. Instead, he announced something unexpected: he would donate part of the buildings to local small businesses and charities. "Let this place serve people, not pride," he said. The audience stood and applauded. His act turned anger into admiration. Even those who once wronged him respected his grace. The land that was once a battleground now became a symbol of patience, wisdom, and integrity. Thomas had not only reclaimed what was his, he had turned it into something greater than himself. Years passed, and Thomas's story became legend in the town. The buildings still stood tall, but now they carried a plaque near the entrance, built on truth, protected by patience. Visitors stopped to read it, learning the story of a man who let arrogance build itself into a lesson. Thomas's porch remained the same, peaceful, overlooking the land he had defended without anger, without violence, just faith in what was right. He often told children who came by, "Sometimes, doing nothing is the loudest move you can make. Let them build their castles, just make sure you still hold the land beneath it." And with that wisdom, he'd smile, sip his coffee, and watch the sunset reflect off the buildings, reminders that justice, though slow, always finds its way home.